128 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, and pursuant to the Standing Order 108(2) and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, September 21st, 2023, the committee is meeting to discuss the policy decisions and market forces that have led to increases in the cost of buying or renting a home in Canada. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the Standing Order 15.1. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the members. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to the microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of the interpreters, I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. So joining us today, we have from the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, Marie-Josée Houle, who's the Federal Housing Advocate. Welcome. Yeah, it's great to have you here. We also have with us from the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, the Executive Director, Mr. Ray Sullivan, and he's online here with us. Okay. And from the Association des Groupes des Ressources Techniques du Québec, we have the Director General, Eric Simon, and the Director of Communications, Eloise Boupert. Welcome. So it's great to have you all here. I know some were on a short notice, so thank you very much for accommodating and making yourselves to Ottawa and here to our committee. And at this time, we're going to hear your opening remarks before we move into the members' questions. So, Madame Houle, please. Thank you.
Okay. Hello. I'm honored to join you today from the unceded and traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Je m'appelle Marie-Josée Houle et en tant...
My name is Marie-Josée Houle, first federal advocate. I'm here to undertake national action to ensure that laws, policies, and programs respect individuals' right to adequate housing. Since Canada has added the right to housing into the Act of 2019 on the National Housing Strategy, we have an obligation to respect this right for all. Since in order to ensure accountability with regard to human rights, I would like to deal with 3 points. First of all, financialization of housing and the negative effects, and the government must address that situation. Secondly, the protection of renters must be a priority. And finally, the government must invest in increasing housing availability across the market.
Is harming people in Canada. And many of the activities this committee is studying are about treating housing as an asset for profit and not a human right. This is financialization, and it has jeopardized Canada's affordable housing supply. So our research estimates that 20 to 30% of Canada's rental housing is financialized, with disadvantaged groups most impacted. So it started in the 90s when Canada allowed the creation of real estate investment trusts and pension funds to invest in financial markets and instruments. And it's not new that these buildings are privately owned, but what is new is that they're owned by large institutional investors whose obligation is maximizing returns for shareholders. So these firms evict tenants, deny services, and dramatically increase rents for profit. Financialization is contributing to housing unaffordability and violating people's human rights. And the federal government must curb financializations with measures like tax reforms that make financialization less profitable, especially for REITs, regulating pension funds so their investments uphold human rights, and preventing banks from financing the acquisition of buildings if the building plan relies on excessive rent increases or evictions. So this brings me to my second point. We must protect tenants and stabilize rents. Financialization, speculation, and inflation are driving up housing costs, and this is having the greatest impact on renters, like people from disadvantaged groups, people who are one rent increase away from homelessness, and people being evicted because of financialization, and the people most at risk who cannot afford any housing at all. So again, curbing financialization is a key measure, and the federal government must also work with all governments on rent stabilization measures, ensure national standards for access to justice for tenants facing eviction, and expand supports for tenants facing rising costs. So to my final point, governments must invest in housing for public good and prioritize non-market housing. Our research estimates that Canada is short 4.4 million affordable homes for those in need, and flooding the market of new housing will not solve the problem. And we're losing affordable units faster than we can build them, and financialization is a major contributing factor. So alone, housing, supply alone does not result in affordable housing, and nor does using public funds on incentives for the private sector without safeguards for affordability. So the way forward is for government to invest in non-market housing. It is the best use of taxpayer dollars, and it creates permanently affordable, accessible housing for a wide range of people. It means that disadvantaged groups have more money for food, medicine, and childcare, and it has economic value, and it benefits everyone because it is not inflationary. And when people are not paying so much for their housing, they spend in other areas, which bolsters economic stability. So Canada can protect and grow its affordable non-market housing supply, and we need the National Housing Strategy's $82 billion suite of programs to change course to prioritize non-market housing. And we need the federal government to create an acquisition fund for non-market and Indigenous housing providers to buy, repair, and operate existing buildings. And we need the federal government to attach conditions to infrastructure funding that mandate the creation of non-market housing in new projects and link funding to affordable housing targets. So parmi les mesures, citons le renforcement des critères liés à la
Other measures include the strengthening criteria for affordability for programs under the National Housing Strategy, insurance for CMHC, and other federal programs.
A role to play, but the federal government must lead the way. Merci et au plaisir de répondre à vos questions.
Merci, Madame Hull.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hull.
From Monsieur Simon.
Thank you. Merci. Merci.
Thank you very much for inviting us here to speak before the committee and to underscore the importance of housing in the current crisis. And I am from the Association of Technical Resources Groups. We have 25 groups that are present across Quebec, and we are a social enterprise for more than 40 years. We've been assisting in the creation of housing formulas, for example, cooperatives, non-profit housing, and we represent more than half of social housing in Quebec. And we also have a number of collective housing projects, and we are at the heart of efforts to ensure community housing. We're at all steps of the planning and implementation of housing programs, and we have a strategy as well to assist in finding funding, the preparation of work sites, and the final finishing of buildings. And we have we need allies in order to ensure housing for the most vulnerable groups in our society. The community and social housing can have a very important effect on public finances. This is an important issue, and it's good that the committee is dealing with this issue now. I know that in last summer we compared the situation for housing with Europe, for example, and we looked at housing models as well as our housing model for Quebec and the rest of Canada, and the need to ensure community housing projects. And we see that we're far from the development capacity that we could have in relation to, for example, situation in Europe. In all countries, social housing is a tool to fight inflation and prevents the increase in prices and rents that we've seen in recent years. And I agree with Ms. Houle because what she said about the need for change, I agree with, but I think that it's important that we use our national values with regard to how community housing can provide affordable housing for everyone, drop pressure in the housing market, and meet the fundamental rights of individuals. When housing is not as expensive, that means that with lower costs, lower rents, that gives individuals greater buying power. And when they pay little rent or low rents, that means that they have more money to spend in the economy for clothing, food, and childcare, etc. And it's the cost of housing that's the major factor in their available income. And so we have to maintain affordable housing resources in order to ensure this contribution to the economy. When we see that social housing and where there can be easily in Europe, for example, 200 euros or more lower prices for equivalent housing units. And social housing in Europe, it's people that are not rich, and they have a financial situation where, thanks to their lower rent, they can contribute to the economy of their community and their country, and to have an improved quality of life. And that's why this social housing, well-developed and well-planned social housing, can lead to very positive effects on the standard of living of the residents. It's important to invest in social housing, and we have to have a long-term plan. We have to decide what the objectives are. Perhaps 20% of housing in municipalities should be affordable housing. And ideally, we think that there should be up to 60% of affordable housing and social housing in communities. And there have been announcements about the social housing and assisting social housing, but I think that the planification and will have a better effect on the economy of communities, and will have allow people to have a higher purchasing power. And social housing means that the residents can have a make more contribution to the economy since they don't pay as much in rent, and that also means that they can enter the housing market and don't require a great deal of assistance from the government. And we have a lot of work to do to ensure that here in Quebec, based on our values and the need for social housing, we have to take up the issue of social and community housing and think about affordability and also the tools that will allow for the development of affordable housing. And this is an important solution for our long-term housing crisis. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Simon.
Members, we're going to need to suspend for a short time. We just have to test Mr. Sullivan's equipment to make sure everything is working. So we're just suspended for a minute.
Swear to God, they spend more time suspended in these committees. Does anybody know how the Freedom Convoy is doing in Ottawa? I haven't seen too much on it, but yeah, some of the homes being built in my area are gigantic. They're massive houses.
The Canadian Housing and Renewal Association Executive Director, Mr. Ray Sullivan. So please, for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Good morning. Bonjour, Quay. And I do apologize that I can't be present in person to talk to you about this very important topic. My name is Ray Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director of CHRA, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. I'm here in Ottawa on Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. And I say that because whenever we talk about housing, it's important to remember that Indigenous people are disproportionately represented among people who are in housing need, in housing precarity, and without housing. And we owe Indigenous peoples a great debt, and that includes a debt of housing justice. CHRA is the national voice of community housing. Our members are nonprofit, co-op, and public housing providers, and also provincial and territorial governments, service agencies, advocacy organizations. We are seized with this housing crisis. And your work on this topic has shown that we are in an affordable housing crisis, but the question is why? And this is not a temporary or short-term phenomenon. It has been building for decades, and it starts with the undersupply of non-market community housing. As a percentage of overall housing supply, Canada has about half the community housing stock of the OECD average. In fact, it's even proportionately slightly less than in the United States. We started down this track 30 years ago when the federal government withdrew from community housing. And we were on track to beat the OECD average, but now we've fallen far behind. And the current crisis is the consequence. An adequate supply of community housing acts as a stabilizing force in the housing market. So we need to focus on the goal, the long-term goal of doubling the supply of non-market community housing. And I don't think you're hearing this for the first time. It was a strong recommendation from Scotiabank a year ago. There's also a recommendation from the National Housing Accord, group of private sector academic and community housing experts. And there's a growing consensus that this is the target that we have to reach. The priority as we do this has to be a fully funded for Indigenous by Indigenous housing strategy. And Budget 2023 committed $4 billion over 7 years for urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing, but the government's own National Housing Council has estimated the need at $6.3 billion per year. And I can assure you that there remains a very strong consensus among the broader community housing sector that this is priority number one. So how do we scale up community housing? Well, first we need stable, predictable funding and financing from the federal government. When interest rates go up, a project can only afford a smaller loan. So grants and contributions are needed to fill those gaps. Yet, as we saw interest rates go up in 2023, we saw federal grants and contributions go down, making new development projects unviable. So we need to restore and increase capital funding under the National Housing Strategy. And this includes pre-development funding. It costs a couple $100,000 to get a project to a shovel-ready application stage. And if you were to go to CMHC's website right now and look up pre-development seed funding, it says that the application portal is closed until further notice, and it said that for many months. So pre-development funding has to be available reliably all year long as a funded program. And significantly, we need land. There's a large inventory of federal land that can be made available for non-market community housing, but it is limited by a very small budget under the Federal Lands Initiative. Blow that program up. Unlock the potential of federal land by switching to a model of $1 100-year leases to nonprofits, co-ops, and community land trusts. And look, new development takes time. And while we need to increase the pace of building new community housing, there's also an option that can have quick turnaround and near immediate impact, acquisitions. For every one affordable home created under the National Housing Strategy, we are losing 11 affordable rents in the private market. We're actually falling behind. So we need to invest in a national acquisitions fund to help nonprofits, co-ops, and land trusts acquire existing rental properties, protect tenancies, and stabilize rents. Now, all of this costs money. Housing is expensive. That's actually the problem we're trying to solve, right? So it's going to take money to solve it, but I have good news for you. Investing in community housing is non-inflationary, and it has a significant positive impact on economic productivity. Et mon collègue Eric, lui aussi, l'a bien expliqué. We released
As my colleague explained, we
Canada that shows an increase in the market share of community housing by just 1.5% will improve productivity by a massive 5.7 to 9.3% and add a non-inflationary boost of $67 billion to $136 billion to the economy. And I want to be clear, this isn't the economic impact from construction activity. This is improvement to economic efficiency from having a greater supply of community housing. So increasing the supply of community housing increases productivity, which improves quality of life, which benefits everyone in Canada. Thank you very much. Merci, miigwech.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for your opening remarks. And now we're going to move to members' questions. In this first round, the members will have each party up to 6 minutes to ask you questions. We are starting with MP Morantz, and I understand, MP Morantz, you may share some of your time with MP Howland. So, MP Morantz, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for being here on this very important topic. Ms. Uhl, I want to direct my questions to you. I have a fairly straightforward question. How many homeless people are there today in Canada?
Well, thank you very much for that question, and I am in a position to not be able to answer that question today. That is not something that is remunerated in Canada.
Okay. And do you know how many there were in 2015? Okay. How about homeless encampments? Do you know how many there are in Canada today?
The number of people in homeless encampments is not something that is counted in Canada.
And it wasn't in 2015, I presume, either?
No.
No. Okay. Minister Fraser was here the other day, and he actually said, when we asked him about the Housing Accelerator Fund, he said that it doesn't lead to the construction of specific homes. And he's also said recently that I think it's a generational moral failure that there are people sleeping without a roof over their head in a country as wealthy as Canada. And I think we can all agree on that. But what I found interesting was in your report, you said that there is no systematic data collection on who lives in encampments in Canada. Is that you stand by that statement, I presume?
Yes.
Is that correct? So I guess my question is, the minister professes to want to solve this problem, and his government has been in office for 8 years, but there's no empirical method or process in place to actually measure the problem. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I would agree with that.
You would agree with that statement? Okay. And I also note that the Auditor General issued a report in 2022 on chronic homelessness. And I was looking at it. It said that it noted that Infrastructure Canada had spent close to $1.36 billion between 2019 and 2021 on initiatives to prevent and reduce homelessness, but found that the department did not know whether the rates of homelessness and chronic homelessness had increased or decreased since 2019. Were you aware of that report?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's consistent with your testimony today that there's really, even though the government has spent billions of dollars, $82 billion on the National Housing Strategy, $4 billion on the Housing Accelerator Plan, and a multitude of other programs, it's clear, I guess, when we see with our eyes that the problem has gotten more severe. We know that. I had the mayor of Guelph here, Mayor Guthrie, in committee last fall, and I asked him, how many homeless encampments were there in Guelph in 2015? And he said, none. I said, well, how many are there today? He said 20. So we see this going on all over the country, but when the government spends, it could be in excess of $100 billion on this problem, and there's no way of measuring whether or not their programs are successful. How are we to trust that these programs are even working?
Well, I really appreciate the question. First, I want to clarify that we, across the country, there is mandated point in time count of people experiencing homelessness. Having worked in housing loss prevention is really hard to measure, especially in areas in the north where homelessness is not quite as visible, as you would have noted in my Inuit Housing Condition Report. However, the National Housing Strategy Act also requires government to do a triennial review of all National Housing Strategy programs. That report is due out March 31st, and I am waiting on bated breath, as you are, for that report.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, I promised I'd share my time with my colleague, Mr. Hallen, so I'm going to turn the mic over to him.
Thank you, Marty. Chair, I wanted to move the following motion. It's one that I put on notice last week, given that taxes on beer, wine, and liquor will automatically increase on April the 1st. This year's tax increase will be 4.7%, the amount equivalent to average inflation over the past year. Canadians and businesses cannot afford another tax increase. That the committee reports to the House that it calls on the government to cancel its April 1st, 2024 tax increase on beer, wine, and liquor. As we all know, inflation and interest rates are hurting Canadians' paychecks, their pocketbooks, and the businesses. We see businesses' insolvency rates going up. We know that this will hurt tourism and the hospitality industry after they've already been significantly impacted by COVID. This hike will also impact other workers like rideshare and taxi drivers. Many of the people that I talk to in different communities have been impacted who are working in these industries because there's less and less business, especially over the weekends, because less people are going out to restaurants and bars to spend money because of the increases in this excise tax. On April the 1st, the tax on alcohol will be on top of the carbon tax hike and the payroll tax increases that started this January. We know this Liberal government is their out of control deficit spending caused 40-year highs in inflation, forcing the Bank of Canada to raise its interest rates, leaving Canadians with the highest cost of living ever. And as a result of inflation, the government's automatic escalator on the alcohol excise tax will increase taxes on beer, wine, and spirits by 4.7% on April the 1st of this year, without any vote in Parliament. We've heard from different stakeholders that are against this hike because they know how bad of an impact it's going to make on the industry and how much more it's going to be expensive for Canadians. There's stakeholders such as Beer Canada, Wine Growers Association. So Conservatives are calling on this government to cancel its April 1st tax increase on beer, wine, and spirits. This government needs, they have the opportunity, the Liberals have the opportunity right now to do the right thing for Canadians and businesses and support this motion.
Thank you, MP Hallen. I've got MP Blakey and then MP Kelly, and I don't know if anybody else to speak to this. No? Okay, MP Blakey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And New Democrats are certainly of the view that it does not make sense to raise the tax on beer, wine, and liquor at the rate of inflation when we're in a period of extraordinary inflation, well beyond the target that the Bank of Canada has set. We have an excellent panel here, though. I had hoped that this debate might have come closer to the end of the panel. I'd be happy to take up the debate again around noon, but for the moment, I would move to adjourn debate on the motion so that we can have our time with the panel here.
Members, are we good to move back to him? No, there's no comment. Okay. Yeah, so we're voting on adjournment right now. Okay. Yeah. Adjournment? Okay. If they're in full agreement, okay, we'll let it go and we'll get back to our witnesses. Okay. What's that? And MP Hallen, you've got a minute on your time.
Okay.
Yep.
Ms. Hu, I just have a simple question for you. Have you seen that the homelessness situation has been getting worse or better?
Oh, well, I would encourage everyone to read the report on encampments that I just released this week. But to answer your question in simple ways, Absolutely. The visible homelessness in this country has risen, and it's not just in large urban centers, but also in remote and northern areas as well.
When you're talking to some of the people that you deal with on a daily basis, or just Canadians in general, is the cost of living a big factor in homelessness?
It is mostly the cost of housing. That is the big factor, and that was a factor long before the pandemic. It's just gotten worse. That's the reason why everyone that I've met in homeless encampments, or actually in encampments, is because they don't have a safe place to go.
Absolutely. And are there any other factors in their monthly budgets that are affecting? We know that shelter costs have grown, taken more out of Canadians' paychecks. Are there other factors that you're hearing about financially that are getting people to have less at the end of the month?
Well, there's anyone who goes to the grocery store and looks at the prices will see that groceries have also greatly increased in price.
Absolutely.
Thank you, MP Howland. And now we're going to MP Zarowitz, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all our witnesses today for their very important testimony and the information you presented today. Ms. Houle, I'm going to start with the first question to you. Thank you for the encampment report that you put out. I did read it with great sadness. I will tell you everything that you've put in there is very much the reality that we see in I would say, all cities across this country. The first question I have to you is the importance of acknowledging and committing to the right to housing. So if you can maybe talk to, do you think it's important for every party in the House of Commons to acknowledge the right to housing? And why is it important for all of us to be aligned on this issue?
Well, first of all, the right to housing was enshrined in domestic law in 2019 in National Housing Strategy Act. The onset of the housing crisis in general in Canada has been long in the coming over the past 30 years because we're doing things backwards. We're doing things from the top down, and encampments is a real fine example of that. Is that we have a top-down approach, which in the treatment of people violates their human right, especially with violence and forced evictions. But the human rights approach is about properly engaging with people experiencing homelessness, first of all, and because they are the holders of the solution, they are the ones who are able to articulate why, what's not working and what is missing and why they are choosing to live in a tent when they're just so exposed and just so vulnerable, because this is a better choice than anything else. That being said,
is it important for all the parties to be aligned on the right to housing in the House of Commons?
Absolutely, because then we're able to get some solutions and be aligned on that, because we need an all-of-government approach. It can't just sit on the federal minister for housing's shoulders.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I also want to put on the record, Mr. Chair, that during the voting marathon in December, the Conservatives voted to defund the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. I'm glad that they have shown some compassion and interest in resolving the issues today, but I do want to put that on the record. There's been some information around, there's been a number of suggestions around an acquisition fund, which I think is a very popular idea. A number of witnesses have mentioned that. A few years ago, one of the things that our federal government invested in Toronto, which was a game changer and not done before, was $1.3 billion was invested in Toronto community housing in order to ensure that there are repairs and it's kept in good condition for those that are already living in our affordable housing spaces. I know an acquisition fund is important, but would also ideas like the types of investments that we've made in Toronto community housing at the city level, is that also a good step as well?
Yes, absolutely. An acquisition fund, and I think the other people on the panel can speak to this as well, is a way to ensure that housing that is already affordable, that will remain affordable, because we can't buy and build our way out of this housing crisis, because we're, as Ray had mentioned, we're losing 11 units of housing that's naturally affordable for everyone that we're able to build through the National Housing Strategy.
Thank you. And then I'll turn my attention to Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, you talked about federal lands and looking at federal lands as one of the ways to start addressing the housing crisis that's underway here in Canada. I am on record, and I have a number of times talked to a number of ministers about making sure that we are doing a review of our federal commercial lands in order to address, and I call it both the housing and the affordability crisis that we have here. I do think it's important to acknowledge that that our federal government has already created over 1,400 new homes on federal properties, and we recently announced that we are unlocking an additional 2,900 new homes on federal properties by 2029. So beyond this continued review, perhaps, Mr. Sullivan, if you could talk a little bit more about what more we need to be doing around federal commercial lands that are in the hands of the federal government.
Yes, and it was also good. Thank you for the question, MP Zerowitz. It was good to hear the minister announce several months ago a change in mandate for Canada Lands Company to ensure at least 20% affordability. I'd like to see that rise higher than 20%, but it's certainly a good start. There's a severe limitation on access to federal lands because there's a fund, the Federal Lands Initiative, where the government essentially buys land from itself and then makes it available to municipalities and nonprofits to develop. So the amount of land that can be made available is limited by that budget amount. And that's why we're advocating to switch to a leasing model. So a $1 lease to a nonprofit co-op or a municipality for 99 years allows us to build that affordable housing, but also allows the government to retain the value of that asset on its balance sheet. And in fact, the value of that asset will grow as the land is being developed. And significantly, one of the other important messages is to look beyond the concept of surplus land and look at the idea of lazy land. I live here in Ottawa. I ride my bike past federal government buildings outside of the downtown core. They are surrounded by an acre of mowed grass. The government office use can still continue in that building, and we can build 50 townhomes across the front of the street and create affordable housing compatible with the existing use. This would unlock the true potential of the federal land inventory across the country.
And do I have another quick question? Okay, then we'll just pass it along. Thank you. Thanks so much.
MP Zerowitz, thank you. Now we go to MP Trudel. Welcome back to the committee. You were here the other day.
Plaisir d'être là, merci.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'm going to deal with this very important issue of housing and the importance of increasing the availability. And Ms. Houle, you have a report, even if we don't have the exact figures, and I think that in Quebec we do have figures. In 2018, there were about 5,000 individuals, and the number has doubled. This just at the time where the federal government announced its strategy, and I think that I understand when you say that we have learned from many sources that the national program to combat homelessness, the federal government is reducing its budget. Whereas in Quebec, we have twice as many homeless people, yet the federal government is decreasing its budget for homelessness by 3%. And I think the federal government isn't really is a bit out of touch. And I think this is really the time to act when we have the homeless population in Quebec that has doubled. I completely agree, and I agree with you. So you talked about the fact that housing is a right, and that the homeless camps, and I've visited a number of areas in Quebec, Montreal, Saint-Germain-Rouen. There are camps in even in small rural areas at the edge of rivers in Lac Saint-Jean and in the Laurentians, and we've never seen that in the past. And I think that among the measures we need, we have to continue to fund emergency measures, but also build social housing. And for homelessness, we have to ensure that these people have the means to reinsert themselves into society. And for this insertion process, we have to provide opportunities and support, and the relevant agencies are overwhelmed. And with regard to funding emergency housing, continue to just react with emergency housing, or aim to build a permanent social housing? First of all, I think that we have to respond to emergencies, but we really have to aim housing, long-term housing. But in the areas you've mentioned, there are many buildings that have been converted to housing, but it's still part of the financialization that I referred to. And we have to be able to invest in housing. We have to stop financialization. It shouldn't be for profit. We have to have all many of the buildings, housing that has been that belongs to private families. They've been purchased, and I think that this is an opportunity to invest in a sector, the tourism sector, for example, that's very stable. And when you talk about spending, we have to prioritize housing, permanent housing, affordable housing that will be accessible to people that need housing. Thank you very much. And Mr. Simon, you've compared the situation in Europe with France and other countries where there is 60% of housing is social. What have you learned from there? And what are they doing that we haven't seen or understood here in Canada? And how can we copy their example? I think we have to accept that social housing is a development tool, meeting people's rights, but also helping them contribute to the economy. It's enormous. This has an enormous effect. And I think that when we have affordable housing for vulnerable and low-income people, and when you develop social housing, you give them an asset, in fact, and the money they save in housing, they can reinvest in the economy. And in Vienna, organizations have a million euros to invest in repairs and in housing. It's not government funding; it's the surplus that the housing institutions use to build and improve housing. And thanks to these activities, they create additional monies. And so what's better, having the homeless or having social housing? And so the value of the social housing they build will be able to reduce rents, give people more spending money, and they can then contribute to the economies, rather than in things like having buildings that are rented out for B&B and things like that. And so we have to make a tremendous effort to decide what the objective is. We know how many people need housing and how many buildings, how many housing units can we build, and then we have to take into account the social and housing needs. And we have to ensure that this money stays in the housing ecosystem, not go into profits for third-party institutions. Thank you very much.
Blakey.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. Some great testimony. Certainly one of the things that I'm hearing is that one of our problems is that when it comes to the housing space, we have a government that really only measures value in the housing space still through profit. And so a lot of the programs that we're seeing are really always ask the question, how do people who invest in housing make profit. And if the answer is that they don't, then there's very little investment. And if there's a mechanism that somehow includes profit, as it did in the RCFI as an example, then government seems to appreciate the value of the program more than when there isn't profit. But when we talk about productivity and we talk about access to housing for workers and all of the more indirect and perhaps harder to measure, although I think actually a lot of folks have shown that it's pretty easy to measure if you have the conceptual tools at your disposal. So one of the things we've talked a little bit about here today is a nonprofit acquisition fund to ensure that community organizations who are competent housing deliverers have the access to capital that they need to compete with the corporate landlords that otherwise are coming in and scooping up those buildings. That's something that New Democrats have supported for a long time. I'm very happy to see the BC NDP move ahead on that in their own way. One of the questions that comes up in the context of a nonprofit acquisition fund is how to make sure that it doesn't simply become a tool for divestment by REITs and corporate landlords who have bought up some of these buildings, done what they're going to do in terms of evicting tenants and jacking up rents, and now see more value in selling the building than continuing to operate it. So I'm wondering, Ms. Houle and Mr. Sullivan, if you might have some thoughts on what kind of guardrails can be put in place to ensure that a nonprofit acquisition fund delivers benefit to Canadians and to people who need access to affordable housing and doesn't simply become a divestment tool for larger landlords. Maybe we could start with Mr. Sullivan and then come to Ms. Houle.
Thank you for the question, MP Blakey. What we need to focus on is interrupting that cycle that you described, where especially, large financialized landlords are purchasing properties, often displacing the tenants who are there so that they can raise the rent, thereby raising the value of the asset, and then selling that asset and returning the profit to their shareholders and members. Moving that building into nonprofit and co-op control interrupts that cycle. That's why we're focusing on acquisition. It protects those tenancies because we know in that transaction in the private sector, those tenancies are at risk. There's a strong motivation from a new owner to increase the value of their assets by displacing those tenants and changing those rents. And the longer someone has been in that home, the more they're a problem on the balance sheet for that new owner. So, grandma who's been living there at 20 years at an $800 a month rent is vulnerable in this situation, and no longer will be when that property is owned by a nonprofit or co-op or a community land trust. That's the outcome that we need to protect.
Ms. Houle, do you have anything to add to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, the committee's already heard from Maureen Fair, who is the executive director of West Neighborhood House, and on the need for maybe considering tax forgiveness for private firms that sell their buildings to nonprofit and public entities. And also, according to Jill Black, who's a housing researcher, owners of rental buildings should be allowed to maybe defer taxes on capital gains and CAA recapture if they sell to nonprofit or buy another building within a year. So there are ideas that are put forth in order to do this, as you say, to do it well.
Simon, est-ce que vous avez quelque chose à ajouter?
Oui, je veux dire que la loi.
I think that the law is important and the action of the government is important, but in Quebec there are cooperatives and there is a requirement that when there is a sale of this kind of a building, the minister can intervene to ensure that the investment by a fund must be into a public good. And when we invest in housing in Quebec, when it's a cooperative, under the law on cooperatives, there is not it is not allowed to sell their building to a private investor without consulting the ministry, at least. And so I think this kind of measure ensures that social housing will continue to exist, and that means that there's guaranteed affordability. And the only thing that we have to do in Canada to ensure affordability, this is the kind of thing we do. And I think that we have to ensure that there are safeguards, because the private sector will always want to buy up, and this is something that's important for affordability.
Ask on the topic of guardrails, you talked a little bit about use of federal land. You had mentioned that there's been an announcement about ensuring 20% of units built on federal land are affordable. The Democrats would agree that that threshold should be higher. But I wonder if there are other guardrails that you think the federal government should be looking at putting in place around the use of federal land for housing to ensure that Canadians get the maximum value in terms of addressing the housing crisis out of the use of that land, as opposed to developers maximizing value through profit.
Thank you for the question. I think all public land, federal, municipal, and provincial, should be set aside for community housing development in any residential context. This can be a mixed income community, which allows a nonprofit developer to leverage the value of market rents to provide even deeper affordability to a portion of the neighbors that there. To me, dedicating 20% is nibbling at the edges. We need to change the mandate of Canada Lands Company completely so that it's not driven toward a return on investment or a return on the value of the land from property, but the social return of creating more affordable community housing.
Thank you, MP Blakey. So, members, I'm just looking at the time. So we lost a little bit of time. So we're going to give each party 2 minutes to ask a few more questions of our witnesses, and we're starting with MP Chambers for those 2 minutes.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Mr. Sullivan, you indicated about federal lands. Quick question: do we have a good enough database on existing federal land stock across the country, of which someone could look at and say, that might be an interesting parcel?
Yes, Treasury Board keeps an inventory of all federal real estate assets, but more importantly, I think for what you're asking about is lands that are suitable for residential development. And the HART project, the Housing Assessment Resource Tools project out of the University of British Columbia, has actually been building an inventory online of those lands and scoring them in their suitability for affordable housing and residential development, city by city.
Thank you. That's very helpful. You mentioned the impact of interest rates and the fact that higher interest rates means less money. A project has to shrink. One of the things we've talked about is this is why it's important for the federal government to take as many steps that it has in its control to bring down inflation so that interest rates can come down. Would you agree with that position?
I agree that interest rates make all the difference when it comes to developing rental housing.
So lower interest rates, better for housing, better for everybody. Ms. Houle, 30 seconds left. I wish I had longer to ask, but if there's anything else you'd like to add kind of from your testimony that you haven't got to yet in the last 30, 40 seconds, you can do so.
Thank you for that. I think, when we're talking about an acquisition fund as well, we really need to expand it to nonprofit seniors apartment buildings, because seniors housing and the financialization of seniors housing and long-term care is something that I'm really concerned about. And, we've seen really high rates of morbidity and mortality in seniors housing that are for profit. And this too needs to be addressed. So thank you for the opportunity to speak about that today.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Chambers, and now to MP Thompson for a couple of minutes.
Thank you, and I'll try to be very quick in my question, Ms. Houle. And actually, thank you for referencing seniors housing. That's something I spend a tremendous amount of time on, and actually, my question there is going to link in to the homeless encampments. And thank you for that report, and also referencing the need to have broader supports, so that it's often health, mental health, physical health, supports for substance use, links with justice system, so it's not criminalized and so on. But from someone who's worked in this sector for a very long time, would you speak about the role of provincial governments in supporting the understanding that there isn't just one door or one solution to homelessness or housing needs, that it is actually multiple doors, and there's various entry points, beginning obviously with someone who's not housed at all, but the role of municipalities, provincial governments, particularly municipalities, and how we need to work with municipalities, and how Accelerator Fund is doing that to really ensure that the wraparound supports are there, but also the zoning and the acceptance that we need multiple types of housing, seniors housing included, to be able to address the crisis in the country.
Well, thank you. I hope I understood your question appropriately. Housing is multi-jurisdictional, and my report on encampments has called for a national response plan to be put in place by August 31st that includes representation from all levels of government, but it needs to be led by the federal government because this is a national issue, and what we're seeing is a patchwork of responses, and some of them are human rights based led, and some are about they're very punitive, and they also violate human rights. So it's very important that we have representation of all levels of government, including Indigenous government, because this is also, an overrepresentation of people who are Indigenous. So it's not only a human rights violation, but encampments are also a violation of Indigenous rights. All levels of government have a role to play. Like you outlined, for municipalities, it is about bylaw, it is about zoning. The provinces, it's also about funding around housing, but also around health. Health is a huge issue. So it can't be a siloed approach, and we need it really, I can't stress coordination. We need to address this. Nobody wants encampments in this country. We should not have encampments in this country.
Thank you, and thank you, MP Thompson, and now to MP Trudel for Domino.
Je vais poser une question.
Thank you very much. A question perhaps all three witnesses might want to reply with regard to housing in Montreal, just in Montreal. There's a 0.46% of property owners who have 1/3 of the available housing, rental housing. So this is a huge number in the hands of a handful of people. And there was an article in the press this morning where the effect of this on the cost of housing, and any way to counter this type of situation, Ms. Hull? I'm sorry, I didn't really measures to avoid to prevent financialization. I mean, you talked about already in your opening remarks, but I wonder if you could very quickly tell us what we can do to counter this financialization. Well, first of all, this would be to have appropriate taxation for the real estate investment trusts, REITs, and I think they are exempted from paying taxes, and I think the government has undertaken a study on this, and I think that would be an excellent first step to ensure that this is less attractive for these trusts. Mr. Simon, the first thing I think we have to do is ensure that this situation does not exist, because I think the government, when you fund private affordable housing, that could be then bought by another private investor, and so the housing would be lost. The affordability would disappear. So I think that when you fund, there has to be something that's long-term and has to stay in long-term housing, and we have to have not only housing for the homeless, but also for people who are just low income, and we have to ensure that this is ensured. Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, anything to say? I think 1/3 of the housing should be for social housing. Thank you.
MP Blakey, 2 minutes, please, and you'll be our final questioner of our witnesses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So we've heard today that spending on housing is not inflationary, and incidentally, we haven't heard these things for the first time today. We've heard that spending on housing is not inflationary. We've heard that there are ways the government can actually leverage public land not only to build housing, but to improve its financial position on the ledger through leasing, as an example. We know that new housing projects can leverage market rent in order to make deep affordability possible for other units. It sounds to me, and I'm curious to get a quick survey of our witnesses today, the issue is for as much as addressing the housing crisis costs money, and I'm not trying to gloss over that, but it sounds to me like the financial resources do exist to address the problem. Is it a problem principally of access to finance, or is it a problem of political will? And getting, long-term funding commitments out of the federal government and getting governments on the same page to get the administrative ducks in a row to be able to mobilize a sector that is clearly ready to deliver on the housing that Canadians need. Maybe we'll start with Ms. Houle and just take a quick answer from each of our witnesses.
Well, as you said it, the sector, the non-market housing sector, co-ops and nonprofits, they are ready. They know what to do. There is the business acumen that exists. We do need the political will, but we need the alignment of all levels of government to make it happen as well. But we also need an all-of-government approach. Like I said, this is not just a housing issue. It is a housing and health, mental health issue as well, and around protections of people.
Thank you. Mr. Simon?
If we don't do all that you said before soon in a big scale, we won't have a housing crisis, we'll have a social crisis. So we have to make sure that we wake up as a whole, as a country, to do what we need to avoid that. And we have all the tools. We just need to have the will and the money and make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Yes, and the commitments that were made under the National Housing Strategy expire in 2028 or before, and we are within sight of that cliff and can see those things dropping off. 4 years is a very short period of time when it comes to developing affordable housing, and we need to ensure that that legacy continues, or we will be in the social crisis that Simon describes.
Thank you, MP Blakey. And just before we get back to MP Helland's motion, we want to thank our witnesses. Thank you for coming before Finance Committee, some with a very short notice, but you did a fabulous job. Thank you for your testimony on this housing study, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Okay, so we'll let you go at this time, and just allow the witnesses to... I do. So, members, back to what we agreed upon. To get back to the motion, I had MP Blakey and then MP Kelly. And then MP Chambers.
As I said earlier, New Democrats are of the view that increases in the excise tax on beer, wine, and liquor shouldn't exceed the target rate of inflation. And so that's not exactly what this motion proposes to do. So I'd like to suggest an amendment that would help this motion do that. And I therefore move that the motion be amended to replace everything after past year with the following. Breweries, wineries, and distilleries are an important source of wealth and employment in the Canadian economy, and industry sales have not returned to pre-pandemic levels. The committee calls on the government to limit the April 1st, 2024 increase of the excise tax on beer, wine, and liquor to the Bank of Canada's target inflation rate of 2%. I realize I read that a little fast, so I might just read it again for the interpreters, and I'll go a little more slowly. I do have copies if the clerk would like to distribute them.
So the clerk will distribute the copies, and maybe you want to read through it a little slower again.
Yeah. So I'm gonna read it slowly again so that the interpreters can interpret it, because I only have it written in the one language.
Okay.
Yeah. That the motion be amended to replace everything after past year with the following. Breweries, wineries, and distilleries are an important source of wealth and employment in the Canadian economy, and industry sales have not returned to pre-pandemic norms or levels. The committee calls on the government to limit the April 1st, 2024 increase of the excise tax on beer, wine, and liquor to the Bank of Canada's target inflation rate of 2%.
Blakey, and I do have some speakers on this. This is to the amendment. I do have, so to the amendment, speakers. Yeah. Yeah. OK. MP Samari.
Oui, j'aimerais juste qu'on ait la...
Wait, no. Yes, I'd like to...
Yes, I would speak on the amendment or the main motion.
Okay, I'll put you on for the amendment now. Then.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Donc, j'invoque le règlement, là, j'aimerais...
So, point of order. I'd like to wait until we get the French version of the amendment, please. We can discuss, but before voting, I would like to have the French text of the amendment.
Okay, are you saying that we can continue the discussion? French text, you will get that. Okay, yes. Thank you, MP Samari. So I've got MP Kelly.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I was just momentarily concerned about the maintenance of the speaking order, but yes, I understand that, and the amendment is, of course, of the same is material to the main motion, and the amendment would reduce the tax increase that is coming on Canadians on the excise on beer, wine, and spirits. I don't support the amendment because I think that the automatic escalation of taxes on beer, wine, and spirits should be repealed outright. It's not right that there would be an automatic increase of any type that wouldn't be put to a vote in the House of Commons, where MPs can actually vote on whether or not the government ought to increase taxes. There's a democratic principle and a governance principle around taxation and votes in Parliament. So the amendment, while undoubtedly a 2% increase would be less bad than the 4.5 or 5% increase that will result in absence of a change to the automatic escalation of taxes that's going to come in. I would support zero tax increase this year, and I would support no tax increase on beer, wine, and spirits until and unless it's put to Parliament the way tax increases should be. Under this government, the tax on beer, wine, and spirits has gone up every year since 2016. They brought in the escalator, raised the tax then, and put the tax increase system on autopilot so that it goes up every single year. And critics of my private member's bill, for example, which seeks to repeal the automatic escalator, critics have said, well, why are you worrying about, just the price of beer, wine, and spirits going up a little bit for Canadians? Canadians can afford a little bit extra if they on something that's a discretionary sort of spending item. And to them, I would say, no, it cannot become a country where the simplest middle class pleasures become unaffordable for working Canadians, where a bottle of wine with a loved one, we just had Valentine's Day last night, where a bottle of wine with a loved one goes beyond that which middle-class working Canadians can afford, or going and having a beer with your friends to watch a hockey game. So these are middle-class consumers who are having their taxes raised every single year, regardless of the will of the current Parliament of the day. It's not right, so I would support repealing the automatic escalator entirely. I would encourage parliamentarians to support my private member's bill that would do that. But in the meantime, I would encourage parliamentarians at this committee to oppose the amendment and support the original motion unamended. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Kelly. Anyone else? No, yeah. MP Baker.
I would just say that I think what Mr. Blakey's proposed is quite reasonable, and we're prepared to support it.
Thank you, MP Baker. And has everybody received the French version? No, we don't have it yet. We do not have it yet. Not yet. Okay. Anybody else like to speak to this amendment? No. Okay. Well, we're.
I'll say
Okay.
something on the main motion.
The amendment.
On the amendment.
Yes.
I don't see why we need to be playing a game of chicken with taxpayers and small businesses. We know that insolvencies are up. They're having a tougher and tougher time because of this government's high tax, high spend agenda. And I think that we should have this conversation again once inflation is down. Inflation is not down, as Mr. Blakey pointed out as well. It's not within the target rate. And the way the trend is going right now, it doesn't look like it's going to get there anytime soon. So I think we should do everything we can to stand up for those struggling small businesses and not put more taxes and more burden on them, because it's not just the small businesses that are suffering from this. Like I mentioned, there's many people inside rideshare companies that are workers and also taxi drivers that I talk to all the time that are seeing their business go down because they're seeing less and less business coming out of restaurants and bars. And I think we should do everything we can to defend their paychecks and make sure that their paychecks are more powerful. And unless inflation comes down to target, we should do everything we can to reduce people's taxes, not increase them. We know that the carbon tax is also going to increase. That's less money in people's pockets as well. And on top of the payroll tax that happened in January the 1st, that's less and less money in Canadians' pockets. We just had witnesses here that talked about shelter costs, and then they talked about food, how they're increasing everything. That means less in people's pockets. If they want to enjoy, I'm not a drinker myself, but I mean, I will defend for small businesses and for Canadians to be able to enjoy those things. That should not be a luxury in this country, which it seems like we're moving more and more towards that. So I will leave it at that, and please urge my colleagues, let's think about those Canadians and small businesses that are suffering. Let's not increase taxes. Let's do everything in this committee we can that we can decrease their taxes and make sure they have more powerful paychecks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, MP Howland. I've got MP Chambers, then MP Zerowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand we're waiting for the French version anyway. So
Yeah.
on the amendment, in principle, I support the original motion. I think the amendment actually has the effect of what ultimately the government decided to do last year. So in the sense that that's an ultimate compromise, I suppose that's better than my preferred approach. But on principle, I'll support the original amendment. Since they have the floor and we're waiting, I'll just provide verbal notice of a motion, which was the French version has been circulated to the interpreter so they can get it ready. So not moving it, just verbal notice of the motion. That with respect to the Royal Bank of Canada's purchase of HSBC Canada, the committee call on the government to require an amount equal to no less than $100 million be set aside in escrow for a period of 18 months to cover any fines, penalties, or levies that may potentially be applied against HSBC Canada in connection with any current or future investigations by regulators or authorities under relevant legislation or regulations, including the Proceeds of Crime and Money Laundering Terrorist Financing Act. And just as I pass the floor back, as we're waiting for Mr. St. Marie's French version, I don't believe it would be fair for the shareholders of RBC to be on the hook for actions, potentially actions taken by HSBC Canada prior to the merger. So I suspect there's already some amount of set aside negotiated. I have no information to that respect, but I'm just providing verbal notice of this motion as a way to make sure that taxpayers will get money if there were any wrongdoings by HSBC Canada prior to the transaction, and that RBC shareholders aren't on the hook, which, by the way, shareholders include many Canadians through their pension funds, etc. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
And we captured that. Thank you, MP Chambers, MP Zerowitz, and members. We still don't have the French version, so. Okay.
Well, then I'm happy to speak for a minute or so, Mr. Chair. So thank you. I want to thank Mr. Blakey for the proposed amendment. I do support it. I will say to you, I have in my tiny riding of 12 square kilometers, I have a lot of microbreweries and a lot of breweries, and they are very supportive of the 2%. It's what they ask for. It's what they asked for last year. It's what they're asking for this year. If they can keep it to the 2%, they feel that it's affordable. So I want to mention that. And then also, Mr. Howland, inflation has come down from 8.1% a couple of summers ago down to 3.4% in December. It's not in the target range, but if you recall that our governor of the Bank of Canada does believe that it's moving into the target range and expects to be there towards the end of this year. So those are just the items I want to put on the record. Thank you. So I do support the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, MP Zerowitz. MP Blakey.
Just a quick question, and this is a technical question because I don't know how the kind of guts of all the great people who support our work.
And I'm going to mention something.
Work.
It might be what I was about to mention.
And I was wondering if the interpreters are the ones translating the motion, if we should suspend so that they don't have to translate us while they're trying to translate the motion.
Clerk can answer that. He sent it to translation. I don't know where that is up there in the ether, but and we don't know how long that will take. I could propose something is we could use this time to transition to the PBC. When we do get that translation, we could get back to this and deal with it. Is that because that will eat up some time too? The transitioning. Is that are members in agreement?
Can I just? I just wanted to ask us. We would be fine with that as long as the vote would be in public.
Well, then we'd have to come back after that again.
Yeah, so then
we
wouldn't agree to we want this in Canada.
Can we agree to publish have recorded votes and publish is that, can we agree to do that, or is that for?
No, that cannot be done in camera.
Do we know how long they're going to be, the interpreters?
We do not. Okay, allow the clerk, please, if you can inform the members.
Just to respond to Mr. Blakey's question, the interpreters are interpreters, they're not translators. We have a translators system, I guess you call it. It's called TipDoc. It's for urgent requests, which is where I sent it. They're working on it right now, and they told me that they did get it. So I know that it's being done as we speak. I just don't know the amount of resources on their end. And so I can't inform the committee on how much time this is going to take.
Okay. Would it make sense just to have a brief suspension then while we wait to see?
Yeah, or like was requested, just so we can get to the PBC, we can transition in PBC. We can also transition back out, and okay, we can come back out.
It's going to be in like 2 or 3 minutes.
Well, we don't know how long it's going to be.
But
so
I would just suspend.
I would agree with that. We should suspend.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I would propose, why don't we have a brief suspension, and if it's not ready by 12:30, then we could start.
We'll suspend till hopefully we get that translation.
All right, guys, that's it. Anyone new to the channel, please like and subscribe. And don't forget to share the video. I've already skimmed through this, and it literally just right to the end, it just shows this. So they never come back.